All right, first, just a little bit about general functions of the bone besides the obvious support. I mean, leverage and movement, which you normally think, your framework of your body, your vertebral column and your limbs and your pelvic and pectoral girdles, right? For leverage and movement, that's kind of what we're thinking, right? Just to kind of keep us upright against gravity. But the other part is your skull, your vertebral column are protecting your brain and spinal cord. Your rib cage is protecting your heart and lungs. Your pelvic, your pelvis is protecting your internal reproductive and bladder structures, right? So that's also that whole protection of vital organs thing, right? And then today we'll talk a little about these other functions, right? Calcium reserve, a little bit about energy storage, and a little bit about that, mostly about this. So, as far as this is like the long bones of your arm are typically these leverage and movement parts, right? Where your two long bones are joined together in a joint. Then you have muscles spanning them, and you're creating this fulcrum area where you can move the body, right? But then that whole other part, flat and irregular bones, right? Protecting your brain, your spinal cord within your vertebral column. And like I said, your rib cage, as well as your pelvic region over here, right? So you can get an idea about the function of these particular types of bones, thinking about what they're doing, what their function is, and how their structure relates to that, right? So when I talk about long bones, just to be clear, your humerus is obviously a long bone, your femur is one, your tibia, your ulnar, your radius, but also all the little individual bones of your hands, right? Your metacarpals and your phalanges over here. These guys, these little ones over here are called short bones. Your hands and feet one, as well as your sesamoid. Right? But these are all, even though they're not long, really, so like these, they have the same sort of structure, right? You have an epiphysis, and then you have a shaft, right, on each one of these little things right here. So those are long bones. But whatever type of bone we're talking about, right, we're going to have that same internal organization, right? Or that is, you'll have this outside compact bone, and then a porous, spongy bone on the inside, right? That lightweight sort of porous struts trabecula on the inside, where you have a much more dense, compact bone on the outside. Any bone you look at is going to have more or less of that. Some have a thicker, compact bone, some have a very thin, right? But they all have this general structure. And so keep that in mind, right? When we're thinking about the vascularization of blood, right? It's a very, very dynamic tissue, right? It's heavily vascularized. You got a couple major blood supplies, right? Going in through it, and there's blood vessels and capillaries going all throughout it, right? So we think of, you think of bone, you could think of them as very inert sort of thing, right? You could replace a limb, right, with very artificial stuff, but when it's living, it's very, very alive, right? And it's going to respond very robustly. Everybody knows your muscles and everything respond to stuff. Your bones do as well. So as far as this internal structure, right, your spongy bone in there, remember those struts, the trabecula that made it up, and you had those big spaces on the inside, in your epiphysis, and a little bit alongside the edge of your medullary cavity. Right, so inside these spaces right here, this is where you're going to find the actual bone marrow, right? And this is the site of new blood production throughout your life, right? So this is that section of the spinal cord, right? There's the actual spinal cord itself. This is the vertebral column. That's your spinous process. It's the body right there of a vertebrae. This is the histology of it. Right? And this is that porous bone. And in between these trabeculae here, you're going to have a lot of blood vessels, but you're also going to have the new blood cells being formed, right? Red blood cells, white blood cells, other types of blood cells are all going to be formed in there. And then because of that, dense supply here, they could be taken out and brought into the rest of the body right there, right? So that's your bone marrow. And, this is where blood cells are produced, right? Red bone marrow, all the types, red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, right? Also, and again, I was going to talk more about this, but I think that you will cover this in 145 when you get to blood. So I kind of not talking about it too much, except to say, since we're on bones, right? That in the spongy bone, right, in your epiphysis, at the ends there, you got that red bone marrow, and that's pretty much, when you're very young, when you're developing and everything, it's going to be throughout the entire bone. And then as you get older, right, it starts to be replaced by, in the middle of this yellow bone marrow, which is basically energy storage. Right? And then it becomes through small areas of your large bones in your epiphysis, as well as like in your osteoclasts or your hip bone. Right. So this is all where your bone marrow is, right? And basically, again, bone marrow, it's developing blood cells and also in some sort of reticular fibers, making a little bit of organization, but they're constantly being formed, right? Your blood cells replace themselves about every 4 months or so. And this is where they're getting them. And then the other reason I would bring this up is, you probably heard of bone marrow, either transplants or examinations, right? The reason why transplants are a thing is because all those stem cells within the bone marrow, right, which can give rise to a host of new cells. But sometimes you're doing it to look for certain blood disorders, leukemia, and different blood disorders, right? So they stick it in, they stick some kind of extractor inside the bone. Apparently this area over here is heavily innervated, your periosteum, and that hurts a lot, right? That's why your bone hurts. But once it penetrates through there, there's no nerves going through this area right here. But anyway, they extract some of that bone marrow there, and then they send it in and say, hey, what's going on? Is there leukemia? Is there something else in there? That's bone marrow, right? All right, but that's all I wanted to say about bone marrow. It's the site of new blood cell production and where you might have a bone marrow examination. So completely new topic here, dinosaur bones, right? This is a 150 million year old dinosaur femur, right? You can almost tell by those condyles. And if you go to any of those museums, right, you'll be able to recognize all the dinosaur bones, right? They have the same sort of any kind of vertebrate, four-legged vertebrate animal has very similar kind of structures, right? They're all modified for their particular purposes, but you'll see the same organization, right? So this is a 150 million year old bone they found or so. And this animal weighed like 50 tons, right? So the rest of the animal, right, is gone. All those blood vessels are all gone. That's soft tissue, that goes away. And the reason what's remaining is the mineralized matrix of the bone, right? And that's why bone lasts, you could find it 150 million years later, right? Because the mineralized matrix of the bone, right, is not something that degrades like biological material, right? Or very at a different rate, right? Much, much hardier stuff. So, this brings us to the, calcium, right? And calcium homeostasis, calcium regulation, right? Bone is your major calcium reserve, right? 99% of the calcium in your body is actually stored in bone. And your bone is made up about 40% of calcium, besides these other potassium, magnesium, carbonate, phosphate, right? All these other minerals in your inorganic matrix. Bone, this is the part that would be degraded, right? In those 150 million year old dinosaur bones. Right? That's organic material. All this is the mineralized matrix. This is where calcium is, and this is where we're going to tie calcium regulation, right? So the overview, starting with this femur right here, it's going to have a lot of calcium, and calcium either are going to be removed from the bone to bring into the body in various ways, or calcium is going to be removed from the blood when you have too much in there and put back in the bone, right? And so we'll look at some of the regulation and how this happens. So before we do that, We want to, why are we so concerned about calcium levels, right? I kind of mentioned way back when I talked about those regulated channels, right? I talked about the nerve impulse coming down and nerve ending, and then they opened up these calcium voltage regulated calcium channels. Calcium rushed in here and caused the vesicles filled with neurotransmitters to release, right? And then they release neurotransmitters. But the trigger for that was a calcium influx, right? So to get nerve conduction, right, usually you'll need some kind of calcium as a major function of nerve function, right? Of nerve properties. And without calcium, all that stuff doesn't happen, right? And then muscle tissue also depends on both extracellular and intercellular calcium levels. Right? Calcium is released within the muscle cell and it causes your, basically, in a way you'll understand next unit, it's a way that's going to actually let the muscle tissues contract, right? Calcium is a necessary component, right? And you have other things like blood clotting, a lot of enzymes need calcium, right? So calcium, improper levels of calcium, bad things happen, right? If there's too much calcium, sometimes you get calcium deposits, calcium buildup, and those fatty plaques in your arteries could lead to heart attacks. Right? Most of the stuff is going to happen because of things like nerve and muscle function, is going to be affected from low calcium levels. Right? So your heart is made out of muscle. All your muscles are made out of muscle, including the ones that control your breathing. So low calcium levels are a big problem, right? So if you're running low on dietary calcium, you're going to have to bring it up through your bone, right? So the role of bone in calcium homeostasis is to kind of help buffer the blood calcium levels, right? Either releasing calcium into the blood or absorbing calcium from the blood back into the bone, right, to affect the levels. All right, so when we talked about bone tissue, we talked about bone, we had the cell types, we had osteocytes and the lacuna with their canaliculi and everything, but we also had those two other types of bone, osteoclasts, which break down bone, right? So they move in to the bone, they're like little macrophages, they secrete enzymes that digest it. And when they do, calcium is released, right? And then the surrounding blood vessels, right? Remember the highly vascularized bone tissue, right? Is going to pick up that calcium and then it gets to the body right there, right? So calcium is regulated in that way. And then the other part of that whole balance was that osteoblasts would come in, they'd take in calcium and they'd start to build new bone, right? So they're building new bone. So everything we talk about today is going to center around these cell types here, the osteoclasts and the osteoblasts. So the first thing about regulating, right, and we'll talk about blasts and class again, is this hormone, parathyroid hormone, released from the parathyroid glands in response to low calcium levels. Parathyroid hormone is going to be released, right? It's going to be travel in the blood. When it gets to the bone tissue, it's going to promote the osteoclast activity, which is going to eat up bone and release calcium. It's also going to inhibit the osteoblasts, right, which would otherwise take that calcium and make new bone. So osteoblasts are inhibited, osteoclasts are stimulated, right? Overall effect, you're increasing blood calcium levels. So hormones come in and they affect the activity of these two types of cells, either increasing or decreasing the activity. This hormone also is going to promote calcium reabsorption in the kidneys, right? So moving away from bone for a second, just talking about calcium regulation in general. It's also in your kidney tubules over here, right? Parathyroid coming down the blood vessels surrounding it, goes in there. It's going to do something with calcium channels, right? There's calcium you're about to pee out. And then the calcium is going through calcium channels. And then it's going to move from these cells that are lining the tubules into the interstitial fluid, into the blood, right? So it's reabsorbing more calcium. kind of like what we saw with aldosterone, right? Increasing water, right? The hormone came in, and in that case, it increased the permeability to water, and then water flowed out, right? So again, this is something you'll probably see again in renal function for 145. So PTH is also affecting the kidneys besides the bone. Another thing it does, within the kidney, there's another hormone called, it's a active, it's vitamin D really, to release this calcitriol, right? And what that does is it goes into the bloodstream, flows around in there, and then eventually ends up in your digestive system, where it's going to affect the calcium absorption, right? Greater calcium absorption from your digestive tract, right? So now you're getting more calcium into the blood with this calcitriol. Right, so that's your parathyroid hormone doing those basically three things: bringing blood minerals, calcium in from the bone, reabsorbing it from the kidneys, and causing more reabsorption from your intestine right there through calcitriol. So in our standard negative feedback loop, right, we have a decreasing homeostasis by lower calcium levels. Parathyroids, right? There's receptors, they have receptors in them, they're going to detect that change. The effect on detecting them is to increase the levels of parathyroid hormone, right? Basically, it's increasing gene expression, more protein is made, more parathyroid PTH is secreted into the blood. And then they'll go down, do their thing, right? The output will be the PTH, which is going to go to the effectors, both the bone and the kidneys. We're causing an increase in calcium levels, right? Which will turn this signal off right here. Right, so that's your whole standard negative feedback thing. One of the other things that happen is that when your calcium levels increase to a certain degree, right? If it's too high, then that also stimulating some other cells in the thyroid gland to release another hormone, calcitonin, which you shouldn't confuse with calcitriol. But what that calcitonin does, the CT, is to go into the bone, right? And then what that's going to do is inhibit osteoclasts, right? So it's going to stop that breakdown of bone, right? It's also going to somehow speed up calcium uptake by the bone, which is going to, accelerate the calcium deposition by those osteoblasts, right? So basically bone formation and decreased calcium levels are happening by this calcitonin, the CT, right? So this gets into this whole feedback cycle with each other. Low calcium levels make parathyroid hormone, which also is going to increase calcitriol. And then increased calcium levels are going to trigger this calcitonin. So that is your calcium regulation. And this is the summary, right? Decreased parathyroid, right? Parathyroid stimulating osteoclasts, right? Which is going to release calcium in the blood. And at the same time, the kidneys, vitamin D, calcitriol, and bring more calcium in the blood. Too much calcium, increased blood calcium, calcitonin, inhibits osteoclasts, et cetera, right? So that's your calcium regulation and how bone is kind of central to that. And you'll learn more about the kidney stuff, I'm guessing, when you get to kidney.